A body lies silent, a clock ticks on, secrets hide in plain sight. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from this community. Now, let's begin. Jules Maigret sat at the small wooden table in his apartment, the one that looked onto the boulevard. The rain had begun again, a soft drizzle tapping at the glass, blurring the street lamps below. He had placed his pipe carefully on the edge of the ashtray, though it was long extinguished, forgotten in the slow rhythm of his thoughts. Madame Maigret had gone to bed an hour earlier, leaving him with a bottle of beer half drained in the silence of the apartment. There was nothing urgent on his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres. Only reports, unsigned papers, the constant humming of bureaucracy. He had taken advantage of it by coming home earlier, but even here he could not entirely shake the faint tug that something was waiting or about to happen. A kind of weightless expectation sat with him, though he could not have named it. Through the open window he heard the sound of a horse clopping along the wet stones, a cart too late for deliveries. The driver called out once, the words lost in the damp night. Maigret leaned back in his chair and thought of nothing in particular. The clock on the mantel ticked faintly, its rhythm steady, reliable. He was not expecting a visitor, but the telephone rang at a little before midnight, startling the quiet apartment. Madame Maigret stirred behind the bedroom door, though she did not rise. He reached for the receiver slowly, already wearing the look of resignation he always had when duty intruded on the fragile cocoon of his evenings. "Maigret?" he said, his voice thick with the calm of someone who has been sitting in the half-light too long. It was Lucas at the other end, his tone restrained, almost apologetic. "There's been a body found, Chief. Not in the street, in a room above a shop, near the Rue Saint-Denis. A clockmaker's, they say." Maigret listened without interruption, hearing not only the words but the pauses between them. The voice of Lucas carried more than information, a faint unease. Not horror, not urgency, but that slight catch of someone describing a scene they couldn't quite settle into. He told Lucas to wait for him there, then hung up. He put on his heavy overcoat, the one with the worn collar, and picked up his umbrella, though he knew it would be useless against the fine mist that seeps into everything. He did not wake his wife to say goodbye. She would hear the door close and understand. The taxi driver was half asleep behind the wheel, his cap pulled low, the inside of the car smelling of tobacco and damp wool. They drove through the wet streets of Paris, past shuttered cafes and men hurrying under their hats. Maigret sat in the back, his large hands folded over his knees, not thinking of death, but of the warmth of his kitchen and the quiet rain he had left behind. When he arrived at the Rue Saint-Denis, the neighborhood seemed both awake and asleep. A few windows were lit, yellow squares in the black facade of buildings, but the street itself was nearly deserted, save for 2 policemen standing in the drizzle, stamping their feet to keep warm. The clockmaker's shop stood dark except for the upstairs room, where a single lamp glowed faintly behind thin curtains. Lucas was waiting, his hat pulled low against the rain. He greeted Maigret with a nod, offering no explanation, as though the scene itself would speak when the inspector entered. They climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. The smell of watches, cogs, and timepieces wound and unwound 1,000 times. Maigret's hand brushed against the wooden banister, worn smooth by years of touch. At the landing, the door stood ajar. Inside, the body lay stretched on a narrow bed, a man in his 50s perhaps, his face oddly calm. His clothes were ordinary, though his shoes were set neatly beside the bed. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no disorder, only the stillness of death in a place that should have held only the ticking of clocks. Maigret stood at the threshold for a long time, his heavy form filling the doorway, not moving closer yet. He looked first at the room itself, the small table with a half-empty glass, the coat hung carefully on a chair, the shadows where dust had gathered. He breathed it in. The atmosphere told him something. Not what had happened, but that it had not happened by chance. Lucas began to speak, a low murmur of details. Maigret raised a hand to silence him. He did not want facts yet. He wanted to feel the room, the way the lamp had been lit, not too bright, as though someone had expected to sit and wait. The way the bedspread was smoothed beneath the man, as though he had lain down, not unwillingly. Through the thin wall next door, faint and persistent, came the steady ticking of a larger clock, perhaps the clockmaker's own masterpiece. The sound of time measuring itself, indifferent to the man who no longer had need of it. Maigret closed his eyes for a moment and listened. Something here, he thought, was not loud but insistent. A quiet discord beneath the ordinary surface. It was not the body that troubled him most, but the room next to it. The room of the clockmaker. And already, though no word had been spoken, Maigret felt the weight of an unseen presence. Someone's guilt, someone's silence, waiting for him in the damp Paris night. Lucas shifted his weight near the door, careful not to speak. The room had the look of places where people live alone and try not to be noticed. A towel folded with the edges uneven. A saucer with 2 sugar cubes softened by damp air. The glass on the table was not quite where a man would have left it if he had been drinking to the end. It sat a hand's breadth from the stain, as though pushed away. Maigret stepped in and felt the air. It had the flat, cooled breath of a place where a lamp had been burning too long. He touched the chimney with the back of his knuckles. It was warm, not hot. "Who found him?" he asked, without turning. "The owner of the shop, Chief," Lucas answered. "Monsieur Rachon. He lives behind the workshop. He said he heard the man's radio stop, thought it odd. He went up to see. The door was ajar." Maigret's eyes went to the door. The latch had a slight shine to it, polished in a spot by a thumb that had hesitated there. He lowered himself beside the bed, knees complaining. The face of the dead man was smooth, not shaved that evening, but shaved recently. His hair was still damp at the temples. A man in a good suit that had been brushed. The tie had a small stain, an old one, not tonight's. His hands lay on his stomach, the fingers loose. Not the hands of a laborer. The nails were neat and there was a thin line of ink on one thumb, the sort of mark left by a leaky pen used without attention. "His watch?" Maigret said to the room as if to himself. Lucas bent. In the pocket of his trousers. He placed it in Maigret's palm. A cheap watch with a cracked crystal. It had stopped at 11:37. Maigret listened to the big clock through the wall, counting heartbeats without meaning to, and let the silence between the ticks widen. He opened the man's jacket carefully. In the inner pocket, a folded card. J. Thiriet, Comptoir Métallurgique, Levallois. The paper smelled faintly of stale tobacco. No wallet, no loose change. A handkerchief with a faint smear of powder on one corner. Not the man's, unless he used the same scent as a working woman who tried to look fresh at midnight. In the ashtray on the table, one cigarette burned to the paper and crushed. Another had been smoked to the middle, tapped neatly, then set down to go out by itself. On the floor beneath the window, there were 2 dark drops, not blood, only water where a coat had dripped and then been shaken out. He rose slowly and crossed to the window. It was set an inch open, enough to let in the damp. Through the pane, the street lamp smeared the rain as if with a finger. He put his hand to the sill. It was clean in a way windowsills above shops are only clean when someone has taken a cloth to them in the last hour. The cloth had left a faint crescent where a hand had not reached. He lifted the glass on the table and looked at the bottom. A ring of sugar grit clung there. He sniffed. It smelled of poor brandy and something else he did not yet place. He set it down where it had been, a shade off-center, as if the room would tell him he had made a mistake. Lucas waited. He had the habit of waiting around Maigret. The two policemen at the door shifted once, then went quiet again. "Bring the owner up," Maigret said. He did not take his eyes from the lamp. Rachon appeared in the doorway like a man who does not trust doorways. Small, grey, in a cardigan buttoned wrong. His hands were clean in a way that came of habit, not of scrubbing for a visit from the police. He had spectacles that pinched his nose and left little red marks. Behind him, from the open passage, came the steadier ticking of the workshop, deep as a man's breathing. "You called us," Maigret said. "I didn't want to," the clockmaker answered, in a voice that seemed to apologize for all disturbances. "It's the middle of the night, but I heard—" "I don't know. The radio. Then it stopped. I was counting. It always goes until midnight. The young man, he was not quite a lodger. He had been here 3 weeks, maybe 4. He paid in advance. The room is mine. I keep it above for people who come to work on orders. Sometimes a traveler, sometimes the apprentice when his mother is ill." "What's his name?" The clockmaker opened his mouth and closed it again. "He said it was René. He had an envelope with Levallois in the address. He spent his days out, not noisy. He came back at odd times. He smelled of machine oil sometimes, sometimes not. He liked the radio. He would tap the wall when my regulator was too loud. It isn't loud, but he would tap." He offered a nervous smile that did not reach his eyes. Maigret watched this, the little swallow after the words, the hand that went to the spectacles and then to the cardigan buttons. "You found the door ajar?" "I was up for a glass of water. My niece sleeps. I heard nothing, only that the radio stopped before the news. He always left it for the late news. It is foolish, Chief Inspector, I know. But when something happens differently, one hears it. You went in. I pushed with my knuckles. I did not touch anything. The lamp was like this. He was like this. I told the boy to go for the police." He nodded toward the passage as though the boy might be hiding there. "Boy?" "My apprentice. Denis. He's only 17. His mother is a laundress in the passage. I don't want him to see things. He waited downstairs with the officers." "And your niece?" "She sleeps. I don't want to wake her. She has nerves." He said it with a kind of pride, as if having nerves were a distinction. Maigret moved past him into the corridor. It was narrow, smelling of wax and cold metal. The door to the workshop stood open a few centimeters, the air cooler within. He pushed it with his fingertips. The room beyond was a country of clocks, small ones under glass domes, tall ones with their backs to the wall, a dozen pocket watches hung like medals on little hooks, all with faces turned out. There was a bench with drawers labeled in a small, careful hand, springs, stones, hands, screws, and a square of white paper under the lamp where a half-dismantled carriage clock lay like a patient on a table. The regulator stood against the partition, its long pendulum drawing slow commas in the air. It ticked with a sound heavier than the others, as if it were responsible for keeping the room alive. Maigret went to it. He put 2 fingers on the case, feeling the faint tremor. He listened for a full minute. The beat was not quite even. Not wrong enough to stop, not wrong enough to bother a man who slept in the next room, unless he was the kind of man who tapped the wall for small things, which Rachon had said he was. He could picture a hand, the knuckles resting lightly, tapping in annoyance. He looked at the floor under the regulator. Dust had been disturbed there in 2 arcs, the marks of feet turning the case a little and back again. New marks, made since last waxing. He said nothing about it. He only stood with the case under his palm and let the responsibility of the room sink into him. Rachon hovered near the bench, not quite stepping in, not retreating. His eyes flicked to the drawer labeled "screws" and back again, the way men glance at their safe when strangers are in the house. "Do you keep the key of that room?" Maigret asked, still with his fingers on the wood. "There's no key. The lock is old. It sticks. If you lift the handle while you turn, it opens. Who else knows that?" I don't know. The boy, perhaps. The niece knows how to open it. When she cleans at midnight. A flush came into the lines beside Rachon's nose and went away again. When she can't sleep, she dusts. It is a habit. It calms her. But not tonight. She was in bed before 10. Maigret looked at the regulator again, then at the lamp on the bench. The wick had been turned down with a care that speaking men do not take when they leave a room in a hurry. On the edge of the paper, near the tiny screws like fish eggs, there was a faint smear of powder, the sort women leave on envelopes and glasses when they think they are not leaving any trace at all. He put his thumb on it gently, not to disturb it, only to understand it was there. "Bring the apprentice," he said to Lucas, who had been standing so quietly he had become part of the doorway. Dennis came in with his cap in both hands. He had the anxious eyes of boys who work with older men and try to be invisible. His cuffs were damp to the elbow. He had been outside, or he had washed in a hurry. He looked once at the bed in the other room, flinched, and fixed his gaze on Maigret's tie knot. "You fetched the police," Maigret said. "Yes, sir." The voice broke on the sir. "How long have you worked here?" 6 months. He glanced toward Rachon. "I live with my mother. I come at 8 and go at 7, except sometimes late when monsieur has work." "Tonight was late." "No, sir. I left at 6:30. I came back at 10 for a key I had forgotten. Monsieur gives me the shop key in the evenings to open early if he is with suppliers. I remembered on the tram. I ran back. He was in the back with Mademoiselle Yvonne. They were drinking tea. I heard the radio upstairs through the ceiling. It was the woman who sings on Thursdays. I went in by the passage and gave the key. I didn't go up." "What time did you go?" Maigret's tone did not change. 10:15, maybe 20. "Anyone else in the passage?" Dennis thought. The puddle of thought showed on his face. Madame Duval from the 3rd floor was coming down with a bucket. She said the stair smelled of oil. Maigret made a note in his head. He did not take out a notebook. The note would keep. He looked at Rachon, who had begun to nod to himself in little jerks. "Madame Duval." "A widow. She does washing for cafes. She's quick with her tongue." He tried to make it sound like a virtue. From the far end of the corridor, a door opened on a light. A young woman in a dressing gown stood there, holding her arms close to her body as if to keep warmth in. She had powdered her face too quickly. The powder lay like a fine dust on her cheekbones, unblended at the edges. Her hair was pinned carelessly, and one bobby pin stuck out like a small antenna. She looked at the men and passed them toward the room with the bed. Her lips made a shape that might have been "oh," and then closed again. "You should sleep, Yvonne," Rachon said, gentler than he had yet been. She didn't move. Her eyes went to the regulator, then to the glass on the table in the room beside it, then finally to Maigret's face. "Will it take long?" she asked, not to anyone. "It takes the time it takes," he said, and tried to make his voice the way voices are in kitchens at night. He went back into the room of the bed and stood where he had first stood. The ticking of the big clock went on with the patience of jobs well learned. The glass on the table held the same shallow pool. No one had touched anything. He could feel the others in the doorways, held back by a politeness that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with death in a house that must go on in the morning. He picked up the handkerchief again and looked at the powder mark. It was not the same tone as the young woman's. Hers lay grey-white. This was warmer, the kind women of a certain age buy from the chemist because it is on sale. He looked at the edge of the bedspread. It had been smoothed twice. Once with a broad hand that left the weave running one way, and again with a smaller hand that tried to fix what the first had done. "Call for the doctor," he told Lucas, "and for the man from the prosecutor's office. We won't wake the neighborhood yet." He lowered his voice, and it became a kind of blanket. "We'll sit a bit." He took a chair from the corner and put it near the doorway, half in the hall, half in the room of clocks. He sat down, hat on his knees, fat fingers laid side by side, and let his own breath settle into the rhythm of the pendulum. He did not look at anyone. Each person found a place. Rachon went to the bench and cleaned his spectacles with a cloth that was already clean. The boy stood by the door, ready to run, though there was nowhere to go. Yvonne leaned against the frame of her room, her eyes losing focus, then finding it again. The policeman marched in place, boots squeaking, then stopped. No one asked questions. Time did the asking. Maigret thought of his kitchen and the bottle left open on the table, and of his wife, who would wake if he did not close the door as he usually did. He thought of the 2 cigarettes, one crushed, one abandoned, and of the radio that had stopped before the news. He glanced once toward the regulator. Its beat had grown more even, because that is what ears do when they are given steady tasks. But his hand still remembered the unevenness under the wood, a faint limping of time that someone in the house would also have felt. Someone who might tap a wall lightly, 2 or 3 soft taps, not enough to be rude. Madame Duval in the morning, he said at last, to no one in particular, and the comptoir in Levallois. He did not say why. He had not yet decided for himself. He only knew that something in the house objected to being ordinary, and that the objection had been expressed with the smallest possible motions: a turned lamp, a smooth bedspread, a watch that had not been wound, a clock that did not quite beat as it should. The doctor arrived toward 2 in the morning, a thin man with a moustache that had once been black but had given into white at the edges. He greeted no one with warmth, as though death had long ago stripped courtesy from his visits. He bent over the body with the briskness of a man who expected no resistance. His hands moved without hesitation, lifting an eyelid, pressing at the neck, turning the face just enough to peer at the lips. He wrote something in his notebook, the scratching of the pen loud in the room where all the clocks kept their patient beat. "Not violent," he murmured, not to Maigret in particular, but to the lamp. "The heart, perhaps. Or a substance. He's not young, but not old enough. A man can fall asleep and not wake, but this face." He stopped, let the words trail off, and adjusted his spectacles. "I will know more after." Maigret only nodded. He had not expected an answer. The prosecutor's clerk followed, his hair damp with the night's drizzle, looking resentful at being summoned, as though the dead man had chosen the wrong hour to expire. He asked a few perfunctory questions, wrote a few notes, then left with a perfunctory salute, eager to return to warmth. The doctor, too, departed with the promise of a report by midday. By 3, silence returned, broken only by the sound of the pendulum and the faint drip of water in the stairwell where rain had followed boots inside. Lucas sat stiff in a chair, fighting sleep, while the policemen downstairs yawned behind their collars. The house itself seemed to sag into exhaustion, its occupants clinging to the edges of wakefulness. Maigret did not move from his chair. He sat heavy, pipe unlit in his fingers, his eyes half closed but not asleep. He was waiting, though he could not have said for what. A house in the small hours always reveals itself. The creaks and sighs are louder. The little defenses people build against the day's eyes fall away. He knew that if he remained still enough, the truth would come toward him without needing to be chased. It came in the sound of the young woman's door opening again. Yvonne stood there, wrapped more tightly in her dressing gown, her face paler without the powder she had earlier smudged across it. She looked from the inspector to the bed, then back. "Do you need me?" she asked softly. "No," Maigret said, but his tone was not dismissal. He did not look at her. He let her stand there, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The silence grew long enough that she felt compelled to fill it. He was quiet, the lodger. We hardly heard him. Only the radio. Sometimes he went out late. Monsieur Rachon said not to ask questions. Her words had the rhythm of someone defending herself, though no accusation had been made. Maigret lifted his eyes now and let them rest on her. She looked away quickly, down the passage where the workshop shadows pooled. Her hands tightened on the dressing gown. "You should sleep," he said again, in the same kitchen voice he had used before. She did not protest, but her reluctance filled the space like a draught. She closed the door softly behind her, though he knew she would not sleep. The smell of her powder still lingered faintly in the corridor, mixed with the oil and brass of the clocks. By dawn, when the drizzle had thinned into a heavy mist, Maigret rose from his chair. His legs were stiff, his body heavy, but his mind had settled into a calm persistence. The body was removed discreetly, wrapped and carried down the narrow stairs, leaving behind only the impression of weight. Lucas looked at him, awaiting instructions. "Stay here until noon," Maigret told him. "Talk to the neighbors when they come down. They'll have words by then. Words are lighter in the morning." "And you, Chief?" "I'll see the widow Duval. Then Levallois." The boy Denis watched from the corner, his cap still in his hands, as if afraid to put it on lest it show disrespect. His eyes followed the inspector with a mixture of awe and fear. Maigret placed a large hand on his shoulder briefly, not a reassurance but a signal that he had been seen, that he existed. Denis' breath caught, and he nodded though no question had been asked. Outside, the air was heavy with the smell of wet stone. The city had not yet shaken itself awake. A few early carts rattled down the boulevard, their drivers hunched against the damp. Maigret walked rather than took a cab. The drizzle beaded on his coat and slid down his hat brim. He pulled his collar up and let the rhythm of his steps match the heaviness of his thoughts. Madame Duval's building stood 3 doors down, a place where laundry lines crisscrossed the courtyard like the rigging of a ship. She answered his knock quickly, a stout woman with arms red from soap and water. She looked at him with wary eyes, already calculating what he might want. "You were in the stair last night," Maigret said without introduction. "I was, yes. It smelled of oil. The boy was running, nearly knocked me with his shoulder. I told him so." "You saw the lodger?" She sniffed. He was a polite one. Not like some. Always with a tie, even late. But ties don't keep secrets. He looked tired. More tired each week, as if he had weight in his pocket. Not money, something heavier. She crossed her arms. "I don't meddle, Chief Inspector, but sometimes he came back with his shoes dry when the street was wet. That means he wasn't where he said. That's all I can say." Maigret thanked her with a nod, but he stayed a moment longer, letting the silence sit. She shifted, uncomfortable, and added, "There was once a woman. A week ago. Not young, dark coat, red scarf. She went up the stairs quick, didn't come down until after midnight. I know because I was beating the mats in the courtyard. I heard them, not words, but steps." When she closed the door, he stood in the stairwell, breathing in the smell of soap and damp clothes. A woman with a red scarf, powder on a handkerchief, shoes dry in the rain. Little things, each too small alone, but together they made the faint outline of something he did not yet name. He left the neighborhood and took a tram toward Levallois. The Comptoir Métallurgique was a low building with a courtyard filled with stacks of pipes and crates. Men in overalls moved with the weary energy of laborers used to machines louder than their voices. Maigret asked for Monsieur Thiriet, and after some hesitation, a clerk led him inside to an office that smelled of ink and damp paper. Thiriet was a man of 60, with a broad frame gone soft, his eyes bloodshot from more than age. He looked up at the inspector with irritation. "Another inquiry. What is it this time?" Maigret laid the card on the desk. "This man lodged near the Rue Saint-Denis. His body was found last night. He carried your card." Thiriet's irritation faltered. He stared at the card, then leaned back slowly. His fingers tapped the blotter. "René?" "Yes. He worked here. Not long. 6 months, maybe. He kept accounts. A good worker, but distracted. sometimes gone without reason. I told him to be careful. The accounts are not toys. He had debts? The man's mouth tightened. I don't know, he never asked me for advances. But there were whispers. He had visitors here. Not the kind clerks should have. Men in hats too wide, coats too fine for Levallois. And women? Thiriet hesitated, then shrugged. There was one. Middle-aged, well-dressed but tired. She came twice. They spoke quietly in the courtyard. When she left, he did not work the rest of the day. He sat with his head in his hands. Maigret let the silence grow until Thiriet shifted uneasily. If he is dead, then it was coming. He carried something heavy. I saw it. You don't need proof for weight. You see it in the shoulders. Back on the street, Maigret lit his pipe at last, though the damp made it sputter. He drew in the bitter smoke and let it curl around his thoughts. A man who kept accounts, visitors in coats too fine, a woman with a red scarf, a glass of brandy and powder not his own. He walked without hurry, his large figure blending with the grey city. He did not yet have answers, only fragments that clung to him like the mist. But he felt the smell of the case deep in his bones. It was not murder for money, not a killing of impulse. It was something quieter, more stubborn, born of human weight carried too long. As he reached the Seine, a barge horn moaned through the fog. He stood at the railing and watched the water move beneath the bridge, black and endless. He thought of the ticking clock in the room beside the bed, its uneven beat. Someone had stood there, listening to it, perhaps at the very hour the lodger's radio went silent. Someone who could not bear the unevenness, not in time, not in their own life. Maigret's pipe went out, but he kept it between his teeth. He turned back toward the city with the slow determination of a man who knew he would have to sit longer, watch more, and wait until the house on Rue Saint-Denis told him what it had been holding back. Morning loosened itself from the fog rather than arriving. The river took on a leaden color, and the market carts made their way to Rue Saint-Denis with wheels that complained more than the men who pulled them. Maigret went on foot back toward the shop. He stopped once for a coffee at a zinc counter where the barman knew to set the cup without words, and where the mirror gave him his own broad, tired face behind bottles that had not been dusted well. A man from the night shift at the abattoir warmed his hands at the steam. Nobody spoke. The day had not earned conversation yet. He reached the Clockmaker's just before the street stretched itself awake. The shutter was still down, but the slats let through a line of yellow from inside. He did not knock. He went around by the passage, where laundry was already strung like flags in a damp country. In the workshop, the regulator ticked as if it had resumed its dignity, and Rachon stood before the bench in his cardigan, spectacles on his nose, a small screwdriver like a pen in his hand. His glance flickered when he saw the inspector, then settled into something like relief, as if the presence of the police were a frame that kept everything from falling. "Lucas?" Maigret asked. "Downstairs with the concierge," Rachon said. He cleared his throat. "The doctor sent word. He wants to see you later." The apprentice was there too, sweeping sawdust that was too little to need sweeping. He straightened with a jerk that sent the broom clacking against the tiles, and color rose into his cheeks. Yvonne was not visible. The air held a faint scent of coffee and that particular chalky sweetness of cheap powder, as if it had settled overnight into the cracks of the wood and come out now that the lamps were warm again. Maigret laid his hat on the bench. He moved to the regulator and put his fingers once more on the case. It beat a shade more steadily. He watched the pendulum make its patient crossings. "Someone turned it a little," he said in no one's direction. "Only to wipe the case," Rachon said quickly. "It shows fingerprints. People can't resist touching. Customers. I like things clean. You cleaned it last night?" The question was soft enough to be an observation. His hands paused. "Number I told you, I was in bed. Yvonne dusts in the mornings. The boy helps when there is time." The boy swallowed, and the broom resumed its arc, less steady than the pendulum. Maigret looked once at the floor where the dust arcs showed. He said nothing. He turned to the doorway that led to the room where the bed had been. The bedspread had been folded away. The imprint remained in the mattress like a tide mark. On the table, the glass was where he had left it, still with a faint ring. A policeman's habit would be to bag it, to label it, to send it in a van. He had not asked for that yet. The glass could wait. The house could not. Lucas came up the stairs with the concierge behind him, a woman with a face as flat as a washed board. "The neighbors," Lucas said with no enthusiasm. "They have words, as you said." The concierge had two contributions which she gave as if they cost her money. First, that the lodger was polite but did not greet every day, which meant he was hiding something. Second, that on Tuesdays and Fridays, a woman came by in the late afternoon and stood in the shadow of the doorway as if the sun would scorch her. She wore a red scarf tied poorly, so that the knot slipped to one side. "Women who tie knots badly," the concierge said with a sniff, "are the ones who make trouble." "What day is it?" Maigret asked. "Friday." He nodded once. "And this woman?" "She doesn't live here. She comes out of a taxi that has dirty mudguards. She pays the driver as if she were ashamed of coins." "And yesterday?" the concierge thought with her lips pursed. "Yesterday she came earlier, before it got dark. I saw the scarf in the glass of the door." Lucas glanced at Maigret. There was something like the pleased look of a dog that has found a scent. "The baker's boy saw a red scarf too," he said. 10:50. He was delivering to the cafe at the corner. He says he doesn't swear to times, but his route runs like clocks do, as he put it. 10:50, Maigret repeated, though he knew it meant little on its own. He could feel the radio's silence again, the way it had stopped before the news, as if someone had put a hand over the voice to hush it. He let the room's sounds collect around him, the broom, the pendulum, the click of a drawer, as the clockmaker put away a tool that did not need to be put away. He had a way, when he wanted to be told something, of finding himself a chair and becoming part of the furniture. He did that now, in the workshop where the regulator presided. He sat with his hat in his hands and became a weight the house would have to carry. After a while, weights make people uncomfortable. They start to speak. It was Yvonne who came first, as if drawn by that discomfort. She had dressed hastily, the seam of her skirt twisted, her stockings not fully straight. Her face was paler without help, the bones more obvious. She pretended to look for a rag on the bench. She found it where anyone could have found it and rubbed at a spotless clock glass. "You didn't sleep," Maigret said, not to ask and not to accuse. "I'm not a sleeper," she answered, the rag pausing. "I listen at night. The city sounds different at 2 than at 4. What did you hear last night?" Her eyes went to her uncle. He kept his attention on the tiny screw he was pretending to turn. "The radio," she said. "Someone laughing on it." Then not. "I heard the steps after, going down. Not heavy steps, not the boys. A woman." She didn't like the word in her mouth. She shrugged that half-shrug women do when they won't be pinned. "Maybe. The stairs argue with heels, and these did not argue. A woman who knows stairs. And before that? Did anyone knock? Was there tapping on the wall?" Her eyes moved to the regulator as if it might answer. For a moment, the room held its breath. "He tapped," she said. "The lodger. 2 times. A habit. Like a man with a bad tooth. He tapped when the regulator was off. He was particular. He straightened the towels in the kitchen when I turned my back." He said nothing. He straightened. She had given more than she meant to. She resumed rubbing with too much force. The rag left a smudge that was only in her head. Maigret rose. He went back into the room next door and took the glass by its rim, turned it in the light. He sniffed again. "Brandy, yes. and something like the faint bitterness that comes from drops one buys at a pharmacy and pours into tea to sleep. The doctor would put a name to it. He only put a feeling. He set the glass where it had been and stood, large and immobile, until the house once more moved around him. By late morning, word had leaked into the street the way rain leaks under shutters. 2 men came into the shop with watches that did not need repair. They looked toward the stairs and away again, then bought a spring they had no use for. An old woman placed her forearms on the counter and told the apprentice that she had warned her sister against taking in lodgers because lodgers take your keys and your calm. Dennis nodded as if he were the sister, and to blame. Shortly after, noon, the door opened on a woman with a red scarf. The concierge's precision had not been wrong. The knot hung to one side. She was not young and not old. Money sat on her like a garment that had been cut for someone else and altered too many times. Her hands were gloved, short gloves, as if she had stopped believing they should go to the elbow. She stood inside the threshold and looked at the clocks, then at the counter, then at the stairs. Her face had the tautness of people who are holding in words until they can decide which ones are safe. Yvonne saw her first and did not hide her dislike well. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice was low, careful. "I left a watch here, a small one, gold-plated." For a new spring, Rachon emerged as if he had been called by a bell only he could hear. He gave the woman that politeness reserved for customers who make him uneasy. "If you will tell me the name." She named one that did not fit her. It was too simple for her coat, too soft for the lines around her mouth. She and the name did not live together. "And the receipt?" he asked. "I forgot," she said. The lie was a poor one and lay on the counter between them like a coin bent by a hammer. Maigret had not moved, but the woman saw him now. She did not start. She inclined her head a fraction, the way women of a certain age greet authority as something they accept to keep other things steady. He did not speak. He took his pipe from his pocket and turned it in his hand. They let the silence be a room they could step into together. At last, she said, "You are from the police?" He nodded. "I came yesterday," she said, and stopped. Her gloved fingers found the scarf knot and tried to correct it, then gave up. "I came to see my—" She searched for a word that would please no one. "Acquaintance." "René," Maigret supplied. She did not confirm it, but her eyes did their own small movement. "He asked me to bring something. He had trouble sleeping." "Drops." "Something from the pharmacy, the ones the doctor gives my sister for her nerves." She met his eyes with the steadiness of the careful liar. "I brought the bottle. He took a little in the glass. We spoke. I left." She glanced at the clocks as if one might tick a verdict. "I don't know the time." It had begun to rain again, the fine kind. "Before the news," he said. She inclined her head a fraction that could have been agreement. He talked of moving, of going to live somewhere where he did not hear things. He said these people, she gestured vaguely, meaning Levallois or the street or all of Paris, would leave him alone there. "What did you answer?" "That he never went anywhere. He stayed and said he would go. It is a habit with some men." There was no bitterness in it, only fatigue. "Your scarf," he said, with the same casual tone as if asking about the time. "It leaves a little red on the neck." She lifted a hand, without thinking, and touched below her ear. Powder came away on the glove. She looked at the glove with a small grimace, not of guilt, but of annoyance at herself. "I'm not young," she said, as if that explained the world. "Do you often come here?" "On Tuesdays and Fridays." She looked toward the doorway again. "Is he?" "He is dead," Maigret said, and he said it so gently that the words did not break anything more than they had to. She did not cry. Her face became a little less taut, as if what she had been holding in could finally drop to the floor. "I thought," she said. "I thought so when the radio—" She stopped, surprised at what she had admitted. He waited. Once I left it on for him, and he told me the announcer's voice made him feel less alone. She said in a lower tone. Yesterday, he turned it down as I left. I stood in the stair and listened with my hand on the rail. It is a silly habit. You can tell about a person by how they turn a radio knob. He did it carefully, as if not to be rude to the voice. What is your name? She gave it this time, and it fit her better. Madame Vionnet. A dressmaker once, perhaps, before hands began to tremble, a sister with nerves, a small apartment with a window on a courtyard. He could see the shape of her life. Not the details yet, only the shape. You will tell me where you live, he said. I will come to speak to you. She wrote an address on the back of a calling card that had been used more than it should. Her handwriting was steady, careful, the loops closed tight. She slid the card toward him like someone paying an overdue bill. Did he have money? He asked, with the mild curiosity of a man chatting about weather. Not enough to sleep, she said. It was not an answer, and an answer both. She left without her watch, because there had never been a watch. The knot of her scarf trailed against her collar as she went out. In the street, a taxi idled, and she got into it with the neat movement of someone who tries not to disturb the seats. Rachon exhaled in a rush he didn't know he had been holding. Yvonne's face had the set look of girls who decide to dislike a woman for reasons that will be explained later as principles. The boy stared openly. Lucas came up from the cellar where he had gone to smoke and looked a question that Maigret answered with the smallest lift of an eyebrow. The doctor sent a boy with a note just after 1. The report was what Maigret had expected and did not need. No sign of struggle, traces of a sedative. The heart quieted itself under the blanket of it. The words were medical and kind. He folded the paper and did not put it in his pocket. He held it in his hand as if its weight would remind him not to take shortcuts. He went out to the street where the mist had turned to a very fine drizzle again. At the corner, the cafe had put out 2 small tables, foolishly optimistic. He took a seat inside by the window and ordered a beer that he did not drink. He watched the shop through the smear the glass made of it. People went in. People came out lighter by a spring or 2, heavier by talk. The red scarf did not return. He waited until waiting had the taste of metal in his mouth. In the early afternoon, he went back to the Quai des Orfèvres. The corridors smelled of dust and coats. Papers lay on the desk in the anteroom as they always did, like a patient who insists he is not ill. A remark from a superior brushed his sleeve and found no purchase. Lognon, sallow and morose, appeared in a doorway and invited disaster just by existing. "You look pleased, Chief," Lognon said, which passed for wit. "I am never pleased," Maigret replied, which passed for humor. He sent Lucas to Levallois to speak again with Thiriet and to look at the accounts that had made René tired. "Don't ask for ledgers yet. Watch the faces that hand them to you," he said. To Lognon, he assigned the quiet task of finding taxis with mudguards that lied about their last wash, and drivers who would remember a woman who paid as if ashamed of coins. Lognon looked injured, which was how he always looked, and shuffled away as if wounded dignity left blood. Before leaving the office, Maigret telephoned home. Madame Maigret answered on the second ring, and her voice put warmth around the receiver. "You didn't finish your beer," she said, which was not a complaint and not an observation, only a way of saying she knew his night. "There is a woman with a red scarf," he said, because with her he could use one line to say all the lines behind it. "Red does not suit everyone," she said after a small pause in which he could hear the pot lid on the stove lift and fall. "When it doesn't suit, it means a woman is tired of being looked through. She wants to be looked at." He made a noise that might have been assent. "And people who dust at midnight. They don't want to sleep because sleep brings the truth to sit on the bed," she said simply. "Eat something. You listen better when you have eaten." He thanked her in his way and hung up. He stood for a moment with his hand on the receiver. The world sorted itself a little under his feet. Then he put on his hat again and went back into the damp city, turning toward the address on the card in his pocket, where a woman had tied her scarf badly, and a radio was perhaps still on at a careful volume. The clocks, he thought, would continue to measure things as they had always measured them, but the people between the ticks were the ones who mattered. He would sit in her small room the way he had sat in the workshop and let time, once more, be the thing that asked the questions. The address Madame Vionnet had written led him to a modest building off Boulevard de Clichy, where the pavements always smelled faintly of stale burr, and the posters for music halls were pasted over one another in layers like dead leaves. The concierge was a small woman with a face that looked as though it had been left out in the rain too long. She did not ask questions when he gave his name, only jerked her head toward the second floor and stepped aside. The stairwell smelled of cabbage and damp plaster, the kind of smell that clings to coats long after one has left. He climbed slowly, each step deliberate. He was not in a hurry. Arriving too quickly could make people defend themselves before there was need. When he reached the landing, he heard a radio playing faintly through one of the doors, music from the 1930s, bright, cheerful, and hopelessly out of place in the grey corridor. He knocked once, softly, and after a pause, Madame Vionnet opened the door. Her scarf was gone, her hair pinned more carefully than in the shop, but her face had the same pale tautness as if all colour had been drained during the night. She stepped back without protest, letting him in. The room was small, too neat, with a sofa covered in a crocheted throw, a sewing machine in the corner, and a window that looked onto an inner courtyard where laundry sagged in the mist. A kettle sat on the stove, whistling faintly, though she had not moved to pour the water. "You came sooner than I thought," she said, her voice steady but softer than before. "I walked quickly," Maigret replied. He set his hat on the table and took a chair without asking. She moved to the stove, turned off the kettle, and poured water into a chipped teapot as if making tea were the proper prelude to all confessions. For a long moment, he said nothing. He watched the small movements of her hands, the way she smoothed her skirt before sitting opposite him, the way her eyes glanced once toward the sewing machine as though it could shield her. "You saw him often?" Maigret began, almost gently. She nodded. "Tuesdays and Fridays, as I said. Sometimes more. He wasn't a lover, if that's what you wonder. I'm past the age for lovers. He was a man I felt sorry for. And perhaps, in a way, he felt sorry for me. We recognized something in each other." "What was that?" "Loneliness." The word came out flat, unadorned. "He used to say he couldn't bear the silence of his room. That's why he left the radio on. Even when he went out, he left it on, as though voices could guard the furniture." Maigret's fingers tightened around the bowl of his pipe, though he didn't light it. "You brought him medicine?" "Yes. Only a few drops. Enough to sleep. He said his heart beat too quickly at night, as if the clocks around him were all inside his chest. He thought if he could slow it down, he might rest." "And yesterday?" She hesitated, then poured tea into 2 cups, though she did not ask if he wanted it. She pushed one toward him. He let it sit. "Yesterday he was different," she said at last. "More agitated. He said someone was watching him, someone from Levallois. He laughed at himself afterward, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that eases a worry. He asked me to stay, and I nearly did, but my sister was waiting. I left the bottle with him." She folded her hands in her lap. "You found it?" "There was a glass," Maigret said, watching her eyes. She did not flinch, but her shoulders sagged. "I shouldn't have left it. He wasn't careful with things. He was the sort who empties too much salt into the soup and shrugs. Perhaps—" She stopped and pressed her lips together. "You think he took too much," Maigret finished. "Or someone helped him," she whispered. Her eyes flicked to the window, then back to him. "Monsieur Thiriet, perhaps? Or one of those men who came in the fine coats. He never told me who they were, but he grew nervous after each visit, like a boy after a scolding. Maigret let the silence stretch until the ticking of a small alarm clock on the mantelpiece became too loud. He rose slowly, placed his hat back on his head and said, "I will come again." She did not stop him. Her eyes followed him to the door with a strange mixture of relief and dread, as though she had given away just enough to feel lighter but not enough to be safe. The corridor smelled even more strongly of cabbage as he descended. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain again, the sort that soaked through seams and collars without a sound. He walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. His heavy figure stooped slightly, his thoughts circling not around facts, but around feelings. The lodger's agitation, the woman's weariness, the boy's anxiousness, the clockmaker's evasions. They were pieces of a puzzle, but one made of sighs and half-truths rather than clean edges. At the office, Lucas was waiting with a folder under his arm, his face showing the eagerness of a man who believes he has brought something useful. "The accounts from Levallois, Chief? You were right, they're irregular. Small amounts missing, but regular. Enough to be noticed if you're the sort who notices. Thiriet pretended not to, but I saw it on his face." René was stealing, Maigret said, more as a thought than a judgment. "Or covering for someone else," Lucas added. "2 sets of handwriting in the books, one his, one we don't know. Maybe the men in fine coats?" Maigret took the folder and leafed through the pages without real interest in the numbers. He cared more about the ink smudges, the hesitations, the way a hand pressed harder on certain lines as though trying to hide tremors. He closed the folder and handed it back. "Keep it. Let it rest on your desk. Paper grows heavier the longer it waits. Someone will want to move it." Lognon appeared in the doorway, as gloomy as ever, rain dripping from his hat brim. I asked the taxi men. One remembers a woman with a red scarf, Friday night near Saint-Denis. She gave an address on Boulevard de Clichy, paid him with coins, counted twice. "That matches," Maigret said. He did not smile, though Lognon looked as if he deserved credit. "Did he notice the time?" 11, maybe past. He wouldn't swear, said the church bells had already rung. Maigret stood, stretched his back and took his coat again. He was weary, but not finished. "Lucas, stay with the accounts. Lognon, go back to the taxi rank. Ask who else she might have called on. I'll return to the shop." The clockmaker's house felt different in the afternoon. The rain had driven people indoors, and the air smelled of boiled potatoes. The workshop lamps were lit, though it was barely 3. Dennis was at the counter, pretending to repair a watch far too delicate for his clumsy hands. He straightened when Maigret entered, his lips parting as if he might speak, then closing again. Yvonne was nowhere to be seen. Rachon emerged from the back, his face pale, his cardigan more buttoned than usual. "You've been busy," Maigret said quietly. "There are orders," Rachon murmured. "And lodgers." The clockmaker flinched. "I didn't ask his past. He paid in advance. That's all I cared for." "But you knew something," Maigret pressed, his tone still calm, almost conversational. He was nervous. He tapped the wall. He straightened towels. He left radios on. And someone came here, not once, but many times. Rachon's eyes shifted to the regulator, as though the steady pendulum might defend him. "I mind my clocks," he muttered. Maigret stepped closer. His bulk filled the small room, the dampness of his coat bringing the smell of the street with him. "Clocks are honest," he said. "They tell what they are told to tell. People are not. Last night the regulator was turned. Someone moved it." "Why?" Rachon's hands twitched. "Dust," he said again, but his voice was thinner. "Dust doesn't leave arcs on the floor," Maigret replied. "Feet do." The boy Dennis dropped the watch he was holding. It clattered against the counter, its delicate spring unraveling with a shrill whine. His face went white. Rachon snapped at him, but the words were half-hearted. Maigret looked at the boy, then back at the clockmaker. "You'll both stay here tonight," he said quietly. "And tomorrow." I want to see how the house behaves when it's left to itself." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. The ticking of the regulator filled the silence between them. "So, time doesn't lie, Rachon," he said without looking back. "It only waits." Outside, the rain had stopped. The street shone under the lamps, slick as polished stone. Maigret pulled his hat lower and walked slowly toward the corner cafe. He did not want beer or food, only to sit and watch the house from across the street, to let the evening settle around it like another layer of silence. He lit his pipe, the smoke bitter in his throat, and waited, knowing that before long, someone inside would grow restless under the weight of waiting and make the smallest of mistakes. It was never the big gestures that gave people away. It was the little ones, the way a radio knob was turned, a scarf tied badly, a clock shifted half an inch from its rightful place. The cafe across the street was half empty, its windows fogged by the breath of a handful of customers lingering over glasses of wine. Maigret sat near the door, his back to the wall, his wide frame taking up more space than the small chair wanted to allow. He had a beer before him, untouched except for the foam that had settled flat. Through the blurred glass, he watched the shop, its lamps glowing behind the shutters, its doorway casting a narrow band of light onto the wet stones. He let his pipe rest unlit in his hand. He was not waiting for anything in particular, only waiting in the way he knew how, by giving the house time to show its nature. People and places betrayed themselves not under interrogation, but under the weight of ordinary hours. He had seen it too often to doubt. Around 6:30, the apprentice left. Denis emerged nervously, cap in hand, glanced across the street once and scurried into the mist like a rabbit released from a snare. Maigret noted the time without glancing at his watch. A few minutes later, Yvonne appeared in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders, and went down the street quickly, her steps sharp against the pavement. She did not look across. The light in the shop dimmed, then brightened again. Only Rachon remained. The inspector stayed until the lamps of the cafe were being turned off one by one. When at last he rose, he crossed the street slowly, his boots ringing against the stones. He did not knock. He entered the workshop through the door left on the latch. Inside, the air smelled of oil and brass, and the faint must of loneliness. Rachon looked up from the bench, startled, the screwdriver frozen in his hand. "You stay late," Maigret said. "I keep company with clocks," the man muttered. His hands trembled once, then stilled. Maigret moved toward the regulator, laying his palm again against the case. "This one kept him awake," he said. He tapped the wall. "You heard it." Rachon did not answer. His eyes followed the inspector's hand on the wood. "You knew he wasn't ordinary," Maigret continued in the same low, conversational tone. "He was nervous, distracted. He borrowed your silence. But you noticed things. Men like you always notice." Still no reply, only the pendulum beat, filling the workshop with a steady, oppressive rhythm. At length, Maigret left him there, saying nothing more. He climbed the stairs to the empty room where the bed had been stripped, where the glass still sat on the table like a forgotten witness. He stood in the doorway, hands deep in his coat pockets, listening to the muffled ticks through the wall. The silence of the room seemed more eloquent now than when the body had lain upon the bed. It was the silence of interruption, not of rest. He stayed there until the floorboards creaked beneath his weight, then left without another word. The night passed with little sleep. At dawn he was back, heavy-eyed but steady. He stopped first at the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas was waiting with dark circles under his own eyes and a folder of notes. "The accounts, Chief," Lucas said. "I spoke again with the clerks at Levallois. René covered shortages, not for himself, at least not only. He shielded someone else. They say he was loyal to a fault. He took blame easily." Maigret grunted. "And the men in fine coats?" "They came from a supplier in Saint-Ouen. scrap dealers. Rough sort, but not fools. They pressed him for figures. They say he promised to correct mistakes. He was late on payments. They threatened him quietly, the way men do who don't want police. Madame Vionnet, Lucas hesitated. I went by her place. She wasn't home. Neighbors said she left early, coat and gloves, carrying a small case. They think she went to visit her sister. Or perhaps she didn't say. Maigret tapped the desk with his finger. The sound matched the regulator's beat in his head. Find her again. Do not lose her. When he returned to the clockmaker's shop, Yvonne was behind the counter, her hair pinned too carefully, her face powdered too heavily for the early hour. She looked at him with something between defiance and weariness. You keep busy, Maigret said. Someone has to, she replied, adjusting a clock that did not need adjusting. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You said you heard steps on the stairs that did not argue with the wood. A woman's steps. Yes. And yet last night you left in haste. Where did you go? Her hands froze. To breathe, she said after a pause. The house was heavy. I walked until I was cold. He let the silence stretch until she flushed and turned away. You don't believe me, she said. I believe everyone, he murmured. I just believe them differently. She did not reply. In the afternoon he visited Madame Duval again. The laundress was folding sheets in the courtyard, her arms strong from soap and water. She greeted him with suspicion. You know more than you told me, he said plainly. She sniffed. I hear things. I don't always repeat them. But you repeat them when silence grows heavy, he said. Her arms stilled on the sheet. The girl, Yvonne. She went up after the woman with the scarf left. I heard her door close softly. She shouldn't have been out of bed at that hour, but she was, and when she came back down, she smelled of powder like she had dressed for no one. Maigret's brow furrowed. He thanked her and left. The drizzle had begun again, fine as breath. He walked slowly back toward the shop, the words pressing against his thoughts. A girl out of bed, a woman with a scarf, a lodger who tapped the wall to correct clocks. Inside the shop, Raichon looked more haggard, his shoulders hunched, his hands twitching with every tick. The apprentice avoided the inspector's eyes, his broom sweeping endlessly at clean floors. Yvonne stood by the window, her reflection pale in the glass. Maigret took his usual chair in the workshop and sat without speaking. The pendulum swung. Time passed. The house breathed uneasily around him. At last, Yvonne turned, her lips parting as if she might speak, then closing again. Raichon dropped a tool. Denis fumbled with a broom. The weight of silence pressed on them all. Maigret leaned forward, his voice low and steady. It wasn't the drops alone that killed him. It was how they were given. Who poured the glass? No one answered. Only the regulator ticked, heavy, relentless. You all know, Maigret said, his eyes moving from one to the other. But only one of you was in the room after the radio went silent. Yvonne's hand moved to her throat. Denis dropped the broom. Raichon's face crumpled with weariness. Maigret did not push further. He stood, took his hat, and left them there under the weight of the clock's beat. He knew that soon enough, one of them would break. Not because of questions, but because of the silence they could no longer carry. That evening, back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he wrote a brief note in his heavy hand. It was not a report, only a line to steady his thoughts. The House of Clocks holds too much silence. It will break before long. He placed the note in his drawer, locked it, and went home to his wife, where the stew was warm and the table steady. He ate without speaking much, the taste of the case still on his tongue. Later, as he sat in his chair with his pipe, he thought again of the ticking regulator, of Yvonne's powder, of the glass on the table. He knew the truth was close, pressing against the walls like damp. He only had to wait a little longer, as he always did, until the house itself confessed. The following morning, the city lay under a thin fog, the kind that muffled voices and made lamps glow dimly even after sunrise. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres earlier than usual, his coat still carrying the smell of last night's rain. He did not linger at his desk. He summoned Lucas and Lognon, who came in looking as if they had slept less than he had. Papers were shuffled, notes exchanged, but none of it amounted to a conclusion. The case had begun to take on that quality he knew so well. Too many small truths circling around a larger silence that no one wished to name. "Madame Vionnet?" Maigret asked. Lucas shook his head. "She hasn't returned to her flat. The concierge hasn't seen her since yesterday morning. I asked at her sister's, but the sister is ill in bed and claims no visit. Neighbors say she often takes short trips, but never without leaving word." "Which means she left in a hurry," Maigret muttered. He lit his pipe and let the match burn down until it singed his fingers. "And the men from Saint-Ouen?" "They were in Levallois again," Lucas said. "Two of them. They asked after René. Thiriet pretended not to notice, but the clerks said he looked relieved when I mentioned the police were involved." Lognon leaned forward, his pale face pinched. "It's the woman, Chief. Always the woman. They lead men into foolishness. The red scarf, the powder on the glass." Maigret cut him off with a small gesture. "Women complicate things, Lognon, but they rarely invent them. The complication comes from what men already carry inside." He rose heavily from his chair. "We'll go back. The house will be more talkative this morning." When they arrived at the shop, the shutters were still down, though it was past opening. Maigret rapped on the door, and after a moment Yvonne appeared, pale and sharp-eyed, as though she had been waiting behind it. She opened without a word, stepping back to let them in. The workshop smelled of stale tobacco and lamp oil. Rachon was seated at the bench, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly together as if to keep them from trembling. Dennis hovered in the corner, his broom already in hand, though there was nothing to sweep. Maigret said nothing at first. He removed his hat, placed it carefully on the counter, and looked around the workshop. The clocks ticked and chimed at uneven intervals, creating a faint discord. The regulator, steady now, gave the room its slow heartbeat. At last he spoke, his voice low. "You were here, all of you, the night he died. You heard the radio stop, you heard the steps, you smelt the powder." His eyes moved from one to the other. "Which of you poured the glass?" No one answered. Yvonne's lips parted but closed again. Rachon's eyes fixed on the floor. Dennis clutched his broom more tightly. Silence spread through the room until it became unbearable. At last, Maigret turned away, as if giving up. But he did not leave. He stepped into the small room where the bed had been stripped, where the glass still waited on the table. He picked it up again, tilted it toward the light, then set it down. "This glass has been waiting," he said, his tone almost conversational. "It will not wait forever." He returned to the workshop, sat heavily in the chair near the regulator, and lit his pipe. He said nothing more. He sat and smoked, watching the pendulum. Time passed. The silence pressed on the house like a weight. Outside, carts rattled by and the cries of market sellers filtered faintly through the shutters. Inside, the ticking grew louder, as if each clock had decided to speak over the others. Finally, Dennis cracked first. His voice was high, hurried. "I didn't go in. I swear I didn't. I saw her go. I only came back for the key. That's all." "Who?" Maigret asked, without raising his voice. The boy's eyes darted toward Yvonne, then away. His lips trembled. The woman, the one with the scarf. She was crying when she came down. She nearly ran into me. I wanted to ask, but... He broke off, looking stricken. Yvonne turned on him sharply. "You said nothing before. Why now?" Dennis stammered. Because it's too heavy. I hear the clocks at night even when I'm home. I can't sleep. It's like they're inside my head. Maigray's eyes remained on Yvonne. And you? You heard her leave. Her face was rigid, powdered again, though poorly. I heard someone. I didn't know who. You went up afterward, Maigret said gently. She stiffened. No. But the denial came too quickly, too sharply. Maigret let the silence grow again until her shoulders sagged. I heard him, she whispered at last. He was talking, not to me, to himself maybe, or to her before she left. I don't know. I went up after. The door was ajar. He was lying there, his face so calm. The glass was beside him. I thought he was asleep. I touched his coat. It was still warm. Her voice broke, but she caught herself. I smoothed the bedspread. It looked untidy. And you left it that way, Maigret said softly. Why? I was frightened, she whispered. I thought if anyone saw me there, they would say I... She broke off again. Rachon groaned quietly, his face buried in his hands. We should have told you, he muttered. But we were afraid the police would blame us, take away our livelihood. We live by silence here. Clocks do not ask questions. We thought if we kept still it might pass. Maigret studied them, smoke curling from his pipe. He did not accuse. He had no need. Their own guilt weighed heavier than any charge. At last he stood, his large frame filling the workshop. He did not die alone, he said quietly. That much is clear. Whether it was kindness, fear, or carelessness, someone helped him on his way. The truth will not stay hidden. It will come out because silence grows heavier than words. He turned toward the door, leaving them under the relentless ticking. Outside, the air was damp, the street alive with carts and voices. He walked slowly toward the cafe at the corner, his thoughts heavy but steady. The case was not finished, but it was moving. The woman with the scarf had to be found. Madame Vionnet had vanished, and her absence spoke as loudly as her presence had. He knew she was the thread. If he pulled it carefully, the rest would unravel. At the cafe he sat again, ordering nothing, simply watching the house across the street. He could see Yvonne's silhouette in the upstairs window, pacing, her hands restless. He saw Dennis dart out with a bundle, perhaps sent on some errand to distract him, and he saw Rachon move between workshop and counter like a man haunted by the weight of his own silence. The drizzle began once more, tapping softly on the awning above. Maigret drew on his pipe, the smoke bitter, his eyes fixed on the shop. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He would wait, as he always did, until time itself, with its steady pendulum, loosened the tongues of those who tried to hold back the inevitable. The drizzle blurred the outlines of the street as the day leaned toward evening. Maigret remained in his seat by the cafe window, heavy and still, as though his body had absorbed the rhythm of the rain. The house opposite stood silent under its shutters, but its silence was not of peace. It was a silence strained and brittle, the kind that cracked under its own weight. From time to time a shadow moved behind the curtains upstairs, and once the door opened briefly to let Dennis scurry out with a basket. He glanced nervously in Maigret's direction before vanishing down the street, as if afraid the inspector could see through the weave of his thoughts. Around 7, Lucas arrived, his coat damp and his hair sticking to his forehead. He slid into the chair opposite, ordered nothing, and leaned in. I found her, Chief. Madame Vionnet. She's at a boarding house in Montmartre. Room on the 3rd floor. The concierge says she came yesterday with a small case, paid for 2 nights in advance. She's barely left the room since. Maigret listened without changing expression. He tapped the stem of his pipe against the table, then slipped it back between his teeth. Did she receive visitors? Number, but she looked ill, according to the concierge. White as a sheet. Refused supper. Maigret nodded once. We'll go. The walk to Montmartre took them through streets where the lamps flickered against mist, and the cobbles shone slick underfoot. The boarding house stood on a narrow incline, its entrance dimly lit, the brass bell worn by years of anxious fingers. The concierge, a woman with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, recognized Maigret at once. She whispered that Madame Vionnet had not slept, that her light had burned all night. She pointed to the third floor, then retreated into her lodge as though wanting no part in what might follow. The stairwell smelled of coal dust and damp linen. Maigret climbed slowly, his hand brushing the banister polished by generations of tenants. At the third floor he knocked once. There was no answer. He waited, then knocked again, louder. After a pause, footsteps approached. The door opened a fraction, and Madame Vionnet stood there, her face paler than he remembered, her hair pinned without care. She did not feign surprise at seeing him. She opened the door wider and stepped back. The room was small, a bed against one wall, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single chair. On the table lay the small case, unopened. The air was close, heavy with the smell of powder and damp wool. She sank onto the chair and folded her hands in her lap. "I thought you'd come," she said quietly. Maigret set his hat on the table and remained standing. "Why did you leave your flat without a word?" "I couldn't stay. Everything there reminded me. The clocks, the stairwell, the smell of oil. I heard his voice when I tried to sleep." "You weren't his mistress," Maigret said, watching her face. Her eyes lifted to meet his, tired but steady. "Number, he wasn't mine, and I wasn't his. But I carried his burdens. Sometimes that makes a bond stronger than what people call love." "What burdens?" She hesitated, then clasped her hands tighter. "He told me about the shortages, the figures he altered, the men from Saint-Ouen who pressed him. He said he could make it right if he had time. But he never had time. He was always tapping at life, trying to correct its beat, like with your clockmaker's regulator." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "And like that clock, it was always a little off." "Did you give him more of the drops than usual that night?" Her shoulders sagged. "I left the bottle. I told him only a spoonful, but he was desperate. He said he needed sleep more than he needed days. I thought he'd take too much. I told myself I'd come back in the morning and fetch the bottle. But when I heard he was dead..." She broke off, pressing a hand to her forehead. Maigret studied her, the way the light caught the fine lines around her eyes, the tremor in her fingers. He knew she was telling the truth, or at least her truth, but he also knew there was more. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Someone else went into that room after you left." Her head jerked up. "How do you know?" "The glass, the bedspread. They were touched by hands that were not yours." For the first time, fear flickered openly in her eyes. "Then it was her," she whispered. "The niece. She hated me. She thought I came to steal something from her house, from her life. She followed me once, I know it. Perhaps she went in after I left. Perhaps she..." She stopped, realizing she had said too much. Her lips pressed shut. Maigret straightened. He picked up his hat. "You'll stay here tonight. Lucas will check on you. Don't leave Montmartre until I say." She nodded faintly, like a child chastened. Back on the street, Lucas looked at him expectantly. "Do you believe her?" "She's telling what she can bear," Maigret said. "The rest she leaves unsaid, but she's not the one who moved the clock." They walked back toward Rue Saint-Denis. The lamps along the boulevard glowed in the mist, and the city carried on around them, indifferent. When they reached the shop, the shutters were up, and the counter lamp glowed dimly. Inside, Yvonne stood stiffly, her arms crossed, her eyes red as if she had been weeping but refused to admit it. Denis swept again, though the floor was spotless. Rachon sat at the bench, polishing a clock glass with a cloth already clean. Maigret entered slowly, his presence filling the room. He removed his hat, set it down, and stood by the regulator. The pendulum swung in its slow arc, steady, inexorable. He placed his hand on the case. "This was turned again," he said quietly. Rachon flinched. Yvonne looked away. Dennis froze, broom mid-air. "It doesn't matter who dusted it," Maigret went on. "It matters who couldn't bear the beat. He tapped the wall because it disturbed him. Someone else turned it because it disturbed them more, and that someone poured the glass, smoothing the bedspread afterward, hoping to make disorder neat." Silence. The clocks ticked louder. The room seemed to close in around them. At last Yvonne spoke, her voice thin but sharp. "I only wanted him quiet. He made the house uneasy, always fussing, always tapping. I thought if he slept, just slept, things would be calm again." Her eyes flashed, then dulled. "I smoothed the bedspread because it looked wrong. I didn't know it would be forever." Rachon groaned softly, covering his face with his hands. Dennis dropped the broom and stared at the floor. Maigret did not move. He let the silence settle once more, heavier than accusation. Then he said, almost kindly, "It isn't the drops alone that killed him. It was the weight of everything he carried. You only gave it shape." Yvonne sank onto a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. She said nothing more. Maigret placed his hat back on his head and stepped into the damp night. The street smelled of rain and smoke. He walked slowly toward the corner cafe, his shoulders heavy but his steps steady. He knew the case was nearly over. The truth had shown itself not in shouts or confessions, but in the small cracks of silence, in the smoothing of a bedspread, the turning of a clock, the powder on a glass. Ordinary gestures that revealed extraordinary weight. He sat by the window, ordered nothing, and lit his pipe. The smoke curled in the dim light. Across the street, the clocks kept ticking, indifferent, measuring out a silence that would linger long after the case was done. The clocks in the shop continued their steady chorus through the night, each beat overlapping the next, creating the illusion that time itself had thickened. Maigret remained in the cafe until the lamps were extinguished one by one, and the waiter, yawning, made it clear that he wished to close. He stepped back into the damp air, the street nearly deserted, only the faint sound of a carriage rattling away in the distance. He stood for a long while outside the clockmaker's shop, looking at the shutters, listening to the faint, muffled ticking that seemed to seep through the wood, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Then he turned toward his apartment, the rain clinging to his coat like fine dust. At home, Madame Maigret had left the kitchen lamp burning low. A plate covered with a cloth waited on the table, the stew from supper that had grown thick overnight. He ate without appetite, his large hands moving automatically, his thoughts still circling the Rue Saint-Denis. His wife sat opposite, not asking questions, her presence steady and warm. At last he muttered, "It was the girl," and left it at that. She nodded once, as if she had known all along, and rose to tidy the plates. He smoked his pipe in silence before bed, the bitter taste matching the heaviness of the case. The next morning he was back at the shop before the shutters were raised. Yvonne opened the door, pale and stiff, her hair pulled back severely, as though she hoped neatness would erase fatigue. Rachon hovered behind her, his cardigan hanging loose, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep. Dennis scurried between them, eager to appear useful, his broom already in hand. The atmosphere in the shop was taut, each of them moving as though afraid to disturb the fragile balance of silence. Maigret stepped inside without speaking, placed his hat on the counter, and went directly to the workshop. The regulator ticked steadily, its pendulum slicing the air with patient indifference. He pulled a chair to the middle of the room and sat, filling the space with his heavy presence. He did not ask questions. He lit his pipe and allowed the silence to stretch. The smell of smoke drifted into the corners, mingling with the odor of oil and brass. Time passed. The clocks chimed in scattered harmony, and the sound seemed to fray the edges of Yvonne's composure. She busied herself with dusting, her hands trembling slightly. Dennis dropped the broom twice, each time bending to pick it up with frantic haste. Rachon polished a clock glass until his fingers cramped, his breathing shallow. Maigret said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was a net that caught what questions could not. At last, Yvonne stopped dusting. She set the rag down, her movements abrupt, and faced him with defiance that masked exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice sharp but unsteady. Maigret exhaled a cloud of smoke. The truth. Nothing more. "You already know it," she shot back. "You sit there, watching, listening, as if I were some clock to be wound until I strike the hour." "You went into his room after Madame Vionnet left," Maigret said calmly. Her lips pressed tight, then parted again. "Yes, I went. I heard him moving. I don't know what I thought. Perhaps that he would speak to me, that he would explain why he came here, why he disturbed everything. But when I opened the door, he was lying down, the glass beside him. He looked peaceful. Too peaceful. I knew he wasn't sleeping. Not really. And yet you smoothed the bedspread." Her eyes filled with sudden tears, though her voice hardened. "Because it looked wrong. Disorderly. I couldn't bear it. The whole house was trembling with his unease. Even in death he made things untidy. I wanted to make it right, just once." Rachon groaned, his face sinking into his hands. "Yvonne," he murmured, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You think I killed him?" she said to Maigret. "But it wasn't me. I didn't give him the drops. The woman brought them, not I. She left them with him. If he took too much, that's his doing, or hers, not mine." Maigret's gaze remained steady. "And yet you were the last to see him alive." The words hung in the air like a weight. Dennis shifted uneasily, his young face pale. Yvonne's defiance faltered, her shoulders slumping. She whispered, "I only wanted silence." The house was too full of his noise. The tapping, the radio, the sighs. Even his shoes, always too dry when it rained. Nothing about him belonged. I thought if he slept, the house would be itself again. I didn't know it would mean... She broke off, her voice cracking. Maigret leaned forward slightly, his pipe forgotten in his hand. "You smooth the bedspread," he said softly. "But you cannot smooth out what weighs inside you. That is what will speak, whether you wish it or not." No one answered. The regulator ticked on, relentless. By midday, he left them there, their silence heavier than any confession. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he dictated a brief note to Lucas. Not murder by design, but by weariness, by silence, by small acts that became too large. Watch the house. They will speak again. Lucas nodded, though he looked puzzled. He still sought clear edges, where Maigret knew there were only blurred lines. That evening he returned once more to the neighborhood. The street was livelier now, the shops open, children playing in puddles, vendors calling. But the clockmaker's shop remained subdued, its light dim behind the glass. He stood outside for a while, smoking, observing the passers-by who cast quick glances at the door but did not linger. Gossip had already begun to coil around the house. He could sense it in the way people spoke in lowered voices, in the quick shake of heads. The house was marked now, as surely as if a black ribbon had been tied to the door. He did not enter. He preferred to let the weight of the day and the whispers of the street seep into the walls. Tomorrow, perhaps, the girl would break, or the uncle, crushed by guilt, or even the boy, unable to carry the silence. He knew it would come. It always did. When at last he returned home, Madame Maigret was setting 2 plates on the table. She looked at him quietly, her hands steady, her face calm. He sat, removing his heavy coat, and for a while they ate in silence. Afterward, he leaned back, pipe in hand, and murmured. She smoothed the bedspread, but not her conscience. His wife met his eyes, understanding without question. She poured him another glass of wine, and they sat together, listening to the distant hum of the city, while in his mind the clocks of Rue Saint-Denis continued their patient, merciless ticking, each beat a reminder that time would finish what he had begun. The following morning, Paris wore the grey, listless face of a city still unsure of its own day. The rain had stopped, but left the pavement slick and the air heavy, carrying the smell of coal smoke and damp wool. Maigret walked slowly toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his overcoat collar turned up, his pipe cold in his pocket. He had slept poorly, the rhythm of clocks still pulsing in his head, their steady pendulum swinging in the silence of his dreams. At the office, Lucas was waiting with a fresh report, his eyes bright with the eagerness of someone who believed he had found a key. "Chief, I went back to Levallois. Spoke again with Thiriet and two of the clerks. They admitted René had been covering shortages. Not his own, but someone else's. The signature was different, hesitant, pressed hard. They think it was the niece who came once with him to collect pay. Yvonne." Maigret took the papers and studied them without expression. The numbers mattered little to him, but the pressure of the pen strokes, the small tremors in the loops, spoke louder than the figures. He set the folder down. "It was never only the money," he murmured. "Money is only the mask. What matters is what people cannot live with inside themselves." Lognon appeared at the door, dripping rainwater from his hat. He looked even gloomier than usual. I traced the taxi driver again. He swears Madame Vionnet was trembling when she got in. Said she asked him if silence could be heard. He thought she was drunk. He sniffed. They always say strange things, these women, but it means something. "It does," Maigret agreed, rising heavily from his chair. He looked out the window toward the river, the mist blurring its surface. It means she knew he would not wake, and she feared her own part in it. He left soon after, walking again to Rue Saint-Denis. The shop was open, its lamps glowing dimly through the drizzle. Inside, Rachon stood behind the counter, his face waxy with fatigue. Denis was at the workbench, fumbling with tools, his hands too nervous to be precise. Yvonne was not visible. The air smelled of metal filings and boiled coffee. Maigret did not greet them. He went straight to the workshop, placed his hat on the bench, and lowered himself into the same chair he had claimed the days before. He lit his pipe and sat in silence. The regulator ticked, slow and steady, each swing of the pendulum cutting through the hush like a blade. Minutes passed. The silence grew heavy, pressing against them all. At last, Yvonne entered, her hair pinned too tightly, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. She carried a tray with 3 cups of coffee, set it down with hands that trembled, and avoided his gaze. She poured for her uncle and for Denis, then hesitated, finally placing a cup before him as well. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. He lifted the cup but did not drink. He waited until she sat opposite, her shoulders tense. "You went into his room," he said at last. She flinched but did not deny it. "Yes." "You touched the bedspread. You moved the glass." Her lips pressed tight. "I thought if I made it neat, no one would think—" She broke off. No one would think what? Her eyes filled with sudden tears, though she fought them back. "That I wanted him gone. That I was glad when I saw him still, not moving, the house finally quiet. I only wanted peace. I never meant—" Rachon groaned, his head in his hands. Denis stared at the floor, frozen. "You poured the drops into the glass," Maigret said softly. She looked up sharply, her face paling. "No, the woman brought them. She left the bottle. He asked me once to fetch it, but I refused. I never touched it. But you were there, after she left. You were the last." Her voice cracked. "I thought he was already dead. I swear it. I only smoothed the bedspread." The room fell silent again, save for the relentless ticking of the clocks. Maigret smoked quietly, his eyes half closed, as if the truth were not something to be forced, but something to be coaxed out by patience. At last, Denny spoke in a low, hurried voice. "She's telling the truth. I saw the bottle. It was nearly empty. He must have drunk more than he should. He said once he didn't care if it stopped his heart so long as he could rest." His eyes darted toward Yvonne. "She only went in afterward. She didn't pour it." Yvonne's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Rachon lifted his head, his face lined with despair. "Then it is my fault," he whispered. "I let him stay. I saw his unease, his tapping, his sleeplessness, and I did nothing. I thought silence would keep us safe. But silence killed him as surely as the drops." Maigret rose slowly, his broad figure filling the small room. He looked at each of them in turn. "You all carry a piece of it," he said. "The woman with the scarf who gave him the bottle, the girl who smoothed the bed, the uncle who let silence fester, the boy who watched and said nothing. None of you meant murder, but together you made it possible. That is how most deaths come, not from evil, but from weariness, from fear, from small acts that weigh too much." No one answered. Only the regulator swung, indifferent, its pendulum tracing time's steady arc. Later, at the Quai des Orfèvres, he wrote his report with slow, heavy strokes. He did not write of guilt or innocence, only of facts. A man found dead in a room above a clockmaker's shop, a glass with traces of sedative, a bedspread smoothed, a regulator shifted. He noted that there was no evidence of violence, only too much sleep given shape by those around him. The prosecutor would read it, nod, and file it away. There would be no trial, only paperwork, silence, and the slow erosion of memory. That evening, Maigret sat again in his apartment, the lamp casting its soft glow on the table. Madame Maigret served stew, and he ate in silence, his thoughts still on the Rue Saint-Denis. Afterward, he filled his pipe and sat by the window, watching the drizzle blur the lights of the boulevard. He thought of René, the lodger who tapped at walls, who left radios humming so voices could guard him, who sought sleep more than days. He thought of Madame Vionnet, with her tired eyes and badly tied scarf, carrying pity like a burden. He thought of Yvonne, smoothing the bedspread, trying to impose order on disorder, and of Rachon, clinging to silence as though it could shield him. They were not villains, only ordinary people caught in the weight of their own lives. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, the smoke curling around him. Outside, the city ticked on, indifferent, like the clocks in the workshop. He exhaled slowly, his eyes heavy with compassion and weariness. Cases ended, reports were filed, but the truth of human hearts never reached a neat conclusion. There was only silence, time, and the steady beat of life moving forward. And so, as the rain pattered against the glass, Maigret sat quietly, reflecting on the body in the room next to the clockmaker's, and on the silence that had killed as surely as any weapon. The drizzle gave way at last to a pale, thin sunlight, filtering through the clouds as though Paris itself were reluctant to admit morning. Maigret rose earlier than usual, his heavy frame weary but his mind clear. He dressed slowly, filled his pipe, and walked toward the Quai des Orfèvres with the air of a man who knows the end of a story is near, though not yet spoken aloud. By the time he reached Rue Saint-Denis, the shop was already open. The shutters were raised, the lamps lit, and the sound of clocks filled the street like a patient chorus. Inside, Rachon sat at his bench, shoulders bent, polishing brass that did not need polishing. Denis swept mechanically, though the floor was spotless. Yvonne stood near the counter, pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in front of her. They looked up as he entered, but no one spoke. He placed his hat on the counter, walked slowly into the workshop, and stood with his hand resting lightly on the regulator. Its pendulum swung steady, even as though it had been corrected for the last time. He let the silence settle until the ticking seemed to fill every corner of the house. René was not killed by malice, Maigret said at last, his voice low and deliberate. He was undone by silence, by small gestures and fears, by loneliness that pressed too heavily on his chest. Madame Vionnet gave him the drops, out of pity. He drank too much of them, perhaps willingly. But it was you, Yvonne, who entered afterward, who touched the bedspread, who shifted the clock, who left your unease on the room. You did not kill him, but you made his death heavier than it already was. Her face crumpled, but she did not weep. She whispered, "I only wanted him to be still. I only wanted the house to be quiet again." Maigret nodded, his expression grave, but not unkind. "You have your quiet now. But it will not be the quiet you sought. It will be the silence that follows truth." Rachon gave a strangled sigh, burying his face in his hands. Denis dropped his broom and stood trembling as though the inspector's words had broken a spell that bound them all. Maigret did not linger. He left them there with their clocks and their silence, their guilt and their relief. On the street, the air smelled of wet stone and coal smoke, and children's laughter carried faintly from the corner. Life went on, indifferent. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he filed his report in his heavy, precise hand. Death by sedative, taken voluntarily, compounded by silence and fear. No crime to prosecute, only sorrow to endure. The prosecutor would skim it, nod, and place it in a drawer. The case would vanish into paper as so many did. That evening, at home, he ate supper with Madame Maigret. She listened quietly as he spoke, not of names or details, but of silence, of clocks, of the weight of loneliness. She placed her hand on his for a moment, steadying him as she always did, and then cleared the dishes. Later, sitting in his chair with his pipe, he thought of René, who had tapped the walls in search of a rhythm that matched his own, who had left radios humming to keep voices in the room, who had sought sleep more than days. He thought of the woman with the red scarf, of her pity and her fear. He thought of Yvonne smoothing the bedspread, trying to impose order on disorder, and of Rachon clinging to silence like a shield. Ordinary people, bound together by loneliness, by mistakes too small to be noticed until they were too large to be undone. The clocks of Paris ticked on outside, indifferent, marking time for those who remained. Maigret exhaled a cloud of smoke, heavy with weariness and compassion. Cases ended, but people carried on. That was all there ever was. And as the rain began again, soft against the glass, Maigret sat quietly, reflecting not on guilt or innocence, but on the fragile, ordinary lives that had crossed and broken in the room next to the clockmaker's, 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 to the clockmaker's.